Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another session of Dialogue with Prof Mandi Rukuni. Tonight's session is a continuation from last week's session, which was Ubuntu as a business strategy. This is part of the African Strategies in Business Leadership series. And tonight we have a special guest, Dr. Faith Bebe, who will be joining us to present on the topic of impact of African values on Western HR practices. Dr. Faith Bebe is an academic who has specialized in leadership and development. She is also majored in information systems as well as a historian. She has harvested experience in a decorated career as a founder and managing consultant of Enhancement Consultancy. From 2002 till current, where she focused on strategic planning, business management, human capital related interventions. She was also an adjunct lecturer in marketing research, change management, and HR information systems. So tonight, she's also the founder and executive of Flame Girls College in Gweru. So tonight, Dr. Bebe will present on impact of African values on Western HR practices. To those who are joining us for the first time, please like and subscribe to our YouTube and Facebook channels, Dialogue with Prof Mandi Rukuni. Please like and subscribe so that you can always get content in the future. I will hand over to you as we wait for Dr. Faith to join us.
Kevin, I gather, so greetings to everyone and good evening. I'm also looking forward to the talk by Dr. Faith Ntabeni Bebe. I think she's joining now. So Kevin, as soon as she joins, I think it's her talk. I'm not going to say much. If she's here, she can proceed. You go ahead and introduce her. I think you've already introduced her. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Dr. Faith Bebe will make a presentation. After her presentation, we'll open up the floor for a question and answer segment. After that, we'll migrate the conversation to our WhatsApp groups, and the session will be available after 24 hours on our YouTube and Facebook platforms. Please keep your microphones muted at all times during the presentation and when anyone is speaking. Thank you very much. I hand over the platform to Dr. Bebe. Welcome, Dr. Bebe. Tech, please unmute Dr. Bebe. Good evening, Dr. Bebe.
Good evening. Good evening.
Welcome to Dialogue with Prof Mandi.
Thank you.
So I hand over to you for your presentation.
Oh, okay. All right. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. We're just having some slight issues with our screen sharing. So
do you want me to proceed with that?
Can you please proceed whilst we sort that out?
Okay. Good evening once again. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to Professor Rukuni for asking me to come and share on the implications of African values for Western HR practices. I know the original topic was talking about impact of African values on Western HR practices, but every time I see the word impact, I become very uncomfortable. So I'd rather talk in terms of implications of African values for Western HR practices. And in doing so, I'm going to cover the subject under about 6 or so subheadings. I'll look at the evolution of human resources management, looking at the difference between it evolving and it being superimposed, because we'll find that whereas in the Western world, the practice of human resources management evolved over time, when it came to to Africa and the rest of the underdeveloped world, it was simply superimposed, and businesses just accepted whatever came from the West as the best practice. So I'll look at that. Then I'll look at the globalization implications for human resources management. In that regard, I really would be interested in seeing how local values are infused when we get to multinational organizations. I'll also look at context, how context affects the practice of HR management. In that regard, I'll be interested in the exogenous factors, the factors outside the organization. Then the question arises, why Africanize? Why is it necessary to Africanize the practice of human resources management? In doing that, I'll first focus on my own personal experiences, because as a young HR person, I went through some steep learning curves. Then I'll take a look at what the African values are, because we like talking in terms of African values, Ubuntu, and it ends up sounding like everything that looks nice or good. So I'll just take a look at what those African values I'm going to be looking at are, and then I'll look at the current state of knowledge as far as human resources management is concerned in Africa, with particular emphasis on our culture and how human resources managers have handled the Western culture vis-a-vis African culture when they're actually now practicing human resources management. Then I'll look at pairing African values to specific human resources management practices and the likely impact thereof, which I believe is the topic I'm supposed to be talking about. Then I'll conclude my talk. So those are the headings that are going to be guiding this presentation. Perhaps it is fair for us to first look at what human resources management is all about, because we may assume that we're talking about the same thing when we are not. It involves the management of the employer-employee relationship in a way that facilitates the attainment of organizational goals. Perhaps that last part about facilitating the attainment of organizational goals is where things go either wrong or right in as far as culture is concerned. So it incorporates practices such as recruitment, selection, onboarding, or what other people call orientation, managing performance, training, learning, managing people who have been identified as talent, coordinating general workplace relations, compensation issues, and diversity in the workplace. Diversity is a new field, which again comes in with all sorts of cultural implications. So you find that all these topics are actually interrelated. So the process of human resources management is unidirectional. When you're talking about recruitment, at the same time, you find yourself talking about compensation. At the same time, you find yourself talking about how you manage diversity in the workplace. For example, one topic that keeps coming, especially perhaps not so much for Africa, but a lot for the Middle East, is the issue of women in the workplace. Whereas elsewhere, the whole issue of having women in the workplace is taken for granted. But in the Middle East, it's actually an issue. And you find Western practices clashing with local practices over that. So, human resources management is an evolving field. It is a product of an evolutionary process dating back to the Industrial Revolution, and it has evolved in five broad phases. During the Industrial Revolution, focus was on welfare and administration. fair pay for fair work, good working conditions, hygiene issues. Then the next phase was the what was tends to be called the personnel management stage, which is the scientific management stage, where then focus was on measuring the productivity of an individual, measuring the productivity of groups of individuals. And then the next phase was human relations management, also called human resources management, where you have then the behavioral scientists coming in who are trying to understand, so what makes people work? What motivates people to work? Is it pay? Is it working conditions? So that is the human resources management stage. Then you have the strategic human resources management stage, where we're not now talking about systems thinking, where human resources management is looked at within the context of the rest of the organization as one of the systems that is driving the organization. Then, of course, we have global or international human resources management, which largely concerns multinational organizations and organizations operating away from their home countries. So, in considering the impact of African values on Western HR practices, this must be considered, i.e. that it is an evolutionary process. And when it comes to Africa, it is just superimposed. For example, by the time we started having a lot of human resources management in Zimbabwe, we started off from personnel management and then slowly moved into the stage of human resources management. Strategic human resources management, yes, in some organizations, but most organizations actually just are at the human resources management stage. So since it was not a natural progression, that in itself has implications. Because I mean, if a child is supposed to start by crawling and then start walking a bit and then start running, and then you have another child that is just expected to start running, there will be differences in the way in which the practice then evolves. So if I'm to look at the characteristics of each stage, unfortunately we don't have the slide up there, but I hope eventually we'll get to see it. We've summarized the characteristics of this stage: the welfare stage, where the focus is on employee basic needs, provision of canteens, health, appointment of welfare officers, and the personnel stage, where the focus is just on recruitment, basic training, basic record keeping, the personnel management stage, where you have got your workforce planning, your management development, your selection processes, and then under personnel management, that is where you also have things like performance appraisals coming in. That is where you also have things like management by objectives coming in. Then with human resources management, where you then have your enterprise culture and market economy, integration with business, introduction of performance-related remuneration, teamwork, the issue of learning organizations, the issue of culture management, issues of change management, and trying to benchmark with best practices. I believe that is where African practices can influence human resources management, because when you are still looking at the welfare stage, personnel admin stage, performance management, those are just administrative issues. But when you actually get to issues of strategic importance, that is where I believe African values can benefit human resources management practice. So I'm saying I believe it is at the, as I said, human resources management stage, but also at the globalization stage, where infusing local values can make a difference. Companies that operate away from their home countries, the multinational corporations or the global companies, are largely concerned with establishing a balance between integrating practices in foreign operations, but at the same time remaining flexible to address peculiarities of the local environment. So they are concerned with dealing with diverse national contexts, and they attended workplace-related legal frameworks, but it's not just legal frameworks, you also have cultural differences. The preoccupation then is to reduce the risk exposure associated with diversified national cultures, because these tend to influence firm culture, and the influence can be positive, but it can also be negative. So global players is where we can try and find the impact. Although, of course, we can also try and find it in local organizations, because international best practice tends to be derived from Western practices. But the challenge, the biggest challenge that we face is that the practices, as I've already indicated, they are super reported. They are not rooted in the African experiences. They are not rooted in the African worldviews. Again, I would have benefited from us having that slide. But anyway, when we look at HR practices in multinational organizations and in global organizations, you will find that they are influenced by factors that are within the firm itself, and then there's also the influence of factors that are outside the firm. For purposes of identifying the impact of African values, we of course look at factors that are outside the firm. So the importance of context as a factor in the practice of human resources management accounts for the contextual and contingency models of human resources management, because these attempt to incorporate local aspects. So African values are part of the context. And the big human resources questions are, how do we Africanize human resources practices without compromising firm performance? That I'm even saying without compromising firm performance suggests that African practice may be deemed not good enough. But perhaps we can put the question differently. How do we enhance firm performance through Africanizing human resources management practices? Before we even proceed, perhaps the other question is, why bother Africanize? Is it really necessary? What is wrong with the regular textbooks that we're using that largely give us human resources management the way it is practiced in the West? From my personal experiences, I'll just share a few. My main problem as a human resources practitioner some years back was issues relating to cognitive dissonance. When you know that perhaps what works is A, but because industry practice says you do B, then you have to proceed with B. But deep down, you know that things are supposed to be done differently. I'll just give a few examples. Human resources management practice in the Zimbabwean situation, when we talk in terms of a spouse, who is the spouse? And when you fill in the forms, there is only room for one spouse. But is that our culture? Is that our value system? Is it true that spouse is synonymous with one? African societies have no problem with polygamy. So why is it that even here in Zim, 40 years after independence, the employment form still has one spouse? The other issue is the issue of marriage. That one also used to give me a lot of cognitive dissonance. Marriage was equated or is equated with a piece of paper. But is a piece of paper marriage? Is that how we understand marriage within African values? I once had an incident at a client site where I was called to come and handle a dismissal case. They'd already concluded that the employee was supposed to be dismissed because the organization called itself a Christian organization. And the problem they were having was that this young lady became pregnant outside marriage and proceeded to go and live with the man. That was considered sin. So I asked the director of the organization, I said, how did she end up living with the man? And he said the parents sent her there. So I said, so the parents of this young lady have spoken to the man and they know the man. He said, yes, but they are not married. I said, what do you mean they're not married? He meant they had not gone through the Western definition of marriage. I said to him, but do your conditions of service define marriage? When you say they should be married, did you actually go ahead and define what marriage means? No, it was assumed to be marriage as defined by the West. Then another area that used to cause me a lot of cognitive dissonance is the issue of parents. Small father, big father, small mother, big mother. And then when there's death in the family, oh, I need permission to go and bury my father. And again, I need permission to, how many fathers does a person have? But we know in our African values and in our African culture that you can have as many fathers as your father had brothers. Another issue that used to cause me a lot of problems is the issue of children. Which ones are yours? Which ones are not yours? And in our African culture, we know that your sister's children are your children. If you're a man, your brother's children are your children, etc. So, in particular, when there's then death in the family, I want to go and bury my child. But in the company file, there are only 2 children. And now this guy is going to bury 5, 6, 7 children. And another one was dealing with older subordinates. That for me put me through a terrible experience. As a young manager aged 29, I was supposed to be supervising a lady that was, she must have been in her 50s. She was making horrible mistakes, and I'll keep on sending documents back to her for typing. Those were during the days of typing. She slapped me, threw the documents at me and slapped me. She said, you are the age of my children. Those are examples where African values and what we're practicing in the organizations as human resources management that is derived from the West, you find that there is a clash. But my question then becomes, how do we become effective when we're living double lives? Because it actually means when you are at work, you have a different definition of issues from the definition you use when you're at home. Can we become effective when we're working under those conditions? My view is that we can't. Another issue that keeps coming up when we're having a clash between African values and Western definitions of how human resources management should be conducted is the issue of recruitment and promotions and the word nepotism. I've struggled for years to try and define for myself what nepotism actually is and what is wrong or right about it, and why the focus, why people think of nepotism when it is Africans practicing it. When I go to my client sites in companies that are not necessarily run by Africans or owned by Africans, I find that they give jobs to people they know. But when it is practiced within an African context, it is defined as nepotism and as evil. or bad for the organization. Is that always the case? What is so wrong with wanting to work with people you trust, who can even go the extra mile when the going gets tough? Some years back, when I was doing some research into how some African organizations were managing to survive during difficult times, it was very clear that it was because within their workforce, a strong part, a large part of their workforce were people who were related. So when the going would get tough, they would go without salaries or wages, and it was not an issue. But once the business gets out of difficult times and starts perhaps being profitable, and outsiders start joining it, all of a sudden people remember that there's the word nepotism. But when the going was tough, no one remembered that word nepotism. So what exactly is nepotism? At what point does it become a bad practice? And why is it that we only know nepotism when it is Africans practicing it, and when it is other people practicing it, we don't seem to see it? So I've just given a few examples where I found over the years and through experience, a clash between what we value as Africans and Western practices of human resources management. But I talked about values, but perhaps the question is, what are these values? And even as I talk about them, I will move away from the concept of Ubuntu. I'll move away from saying our values are Ubuntu, because I think it has been overused. It is to a point of perhaps even losing meaning. So I'll just identify the African values without referring to them as Ubuntu. One, the existence of a supernatural power or powers that provides guidance and protection. I find I meet this, it doesn't matter whether the African is from West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, a belief in the existence of supernatural powers, or a supernatural power for some that provides guidance and protection. Another value is that of the wholeness of all being, harmony, that the physical, the intellectual, the spiritual all come together. That is what the person is. Then there's the community, valuing communalism, the community, valuing relationships and relatedness, valuing interconnectivity. I am because we are, umuntu umuntu ngabantu, relatedness, ukama, ubuhlobo, solidarity as in sharing burdens, hospitality and caring, respect and responsiveness, deep self-knowledge and self-respect, what they call, in Jebe, they call it ubuzazi and ubuzihlonipha, really deep self-knowledge, to an extent that when then they are criticizing you because you are acting in a manner that is considered at variance with our values, someone can say, awuzazi, i.e., you don't know yourself. Another value is of trueness to oneself and acting in a manner consistent with the true self. Which
sorry, Doc. Sorry, Doc. Can I just please interrupt you 2 seconds? You're able to share your presentation now.
Sure. How do I go? There? How do I? Oh.
You go to your menu at the bottom that says share screen.
Okay.
And then you pick the window with your presentation.
There. Is that it?
Yes.
Then I want to start from the current slide. Would you tell them? Okay. Okay. Is that okay?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Doc.
So I was talking about a deep self-knowledge and self-respect, then trueness to oneself and acting in a manner consistent with the self, with the true self, what in Shona I think they call pachibang, acting pachibang, or in Ndebele they call it yesintu, doing things according to your true self. And I think we experience this a lot, especially when you are trying to put together a contract that is not a written contract. People talk in terms of, let's just do it pachibang, or let's just do it yesintu, i.e., let's just be true to who we are. Then another value is that of reciprocity. Put in Ndebele, they call Chizanda Ziagezana, translated as hands wash one another. And one hand can't wash itself, it needs another hand to wash it. So reciprocity. And then ethics that are guided by the common good and good neighborliness, so that actions are considered right insofar as they lead to people living in harmony, which is also called insofar as they make you a person among persons, or umuntu ebantwini. I'm not sure whether in Shona it will be munupavano, if there's an expression like that, but basically that you are a person among other people. So I've just looked at the values which I believe would affect the practice of human resources management. And I'm sure there are many others, but I'll just focus on those. And as I said, I refuse to use a sweeping statement like, what are our values? Our values are Ubuntu. As I said earlier on, it has lost meaning. But let's take a moment and just have a look at what has been said in literature on human resources management. There are three views. Some see African values as conflicting with good human resources management. I can't pronounce that name. Says transplantation of Western management theory models has not met the needs of African, because elements of traditional values pose serious challenge to African managers. So traditional values are seen as a challenge, not as an enabler, but as a challenge. So this view sees conflict in the two approaches. Conflict between African values or human resources management that is based on African values and human resources management that is based on Western values. But that the traditional values present serious challenges may demonstrate an attempt to change them completely without showing how the change will result in a common good. Remember earlier on, I said, when we talk about ethics in African values, issues of the common good are very important. So if the coming in of Western practices of human resources management are not perceived to result in a common good, then it is only then can you then view traditional values as a serious challenge. Others view traditional values or traditional practices of human resources management as complementary. Paul and others say, despite globalization, several critical aspects of African human resources management remain close to and entwined with culture and tradition, to an extent that they can form part of the African organization's dynamic capabilities. So they see opportunities in the combining of African practices and Western values. Similarly, with Kiza and Basheka and Molose, they see opportunities. For example, Molose and others see Ubuntu collective values as values that can direct personal interactions and therefore contribute towards building teams in organizations, or to build more robust practices within organizations. Then some argue that there's actually nothing new in Western human resources management. There is nothing they're teaching us that we did not know or that we were not practicing. Farai Hungwe 2014, Farai just mentioned as Farai because there's so many new. Says there's supposed to be novel HRM, human resources management concepts like teamwork, quality circles, total quality management, harmony, collective bargaining, which have been paraded as new, are actually part of Zimbabwe culture. They just need to be operationalized. This is nothing new in the foreign practices. It's only a matter of labeling. And when one talks about labeling, what I mean is when something is coming from the West, it is labeled in a very positive way. But when something is local or is coming through from African values or African culture, the labeling is always negative. So there's nothing to change, there's nothing to learn, there's nothing to incorporate. All we need to focus on is the labeling. That is what I feel. So I've looked at what the African values are. I've looked at the state of literature on human resources management practices in Africa. I've highlighted that some view the relationship as that of conflict, that some view it as that of complementing, and that others view it as there's nothing happening here. These things have always been there. And to some extent, one is tempted to agree with Barai in the sense that to really put together the Zimbabwe, that great Zimbabwe city, it called for a lot of human resources management skills. It just would not have happened without proper human resources management practices. So now what I want to look at is how can we then bring in African values into the various dimensions of human resources management practices? What actions can be taken to address the various human resources management dimensions through our African values? I indicated that one of our values as Africans is the issue of respect, community, and relationships. And I believe that those values can inform the recruitment and selection process. I believe that if those values inform the process, actions such as preferential treatment and respect for hierarchy during the recruitment and selection process can actually be incorporated in organizations without causing any disharmony. I believe that if they are implemented with respect, even issues that are labeled nepotism, I believe can be viewed differently. Because if we're going to look at nepotism through the lens of it being part of community, being part of relationships and relatedness, then we will not have any problems with hiring of people we know for as long as they are capable, for as long as they know what they are doing. We will not have problems with hiring even relatives for as long as they know what they're doing. But if it is done in a spirit of, for example, greed, not community, but greed, in a spirit of perhaps wanting to be paid back, then it becomes something negative. But if used properly, I actually believe that it can actually assist organizations to become stronger, especially the so-called indigenous organizations. Because in those organizations, it is very difficult to attract good talent. Because most of those organizations don't have the capacity to pay, especially during the initial stages. So it makes sense to hire people who are joining the organizations, an organization, because they believe they're coming to make a contribution to the community or to a relationship or out of respect. Another African value other African values I highlighted are caring, reciprocity, relatedness, solidarity, hospitality. I believe the welfare dimension of human resources management can benefit from African values in that regard. It may not benefit those companies that are operating, that are not operating in Africa, but for any companies that are operating not just in Africa, but in an environment where collectivism is part of the culture, then those values will add some, will make business sense actually. I'll give you an example. Welfare for Africans, at least, means you have to take care of the funerals. And the funerals, I pointed out earlier on, include that for the mother and the small mother and the big mother and the father and the whole clan. Funeral policies, financial assistance, assistance during times of illness, medical aid, and any other misfortunes. So African values can actually inform an organization in terms of what action to take if that organization intends to retain employees who hold their African values yet. And most people do. African values of community, reciprocity, and solidarity can inform our workforce planning, or what some people call manpower planning, our workforce planning. Respect for the community demands that when you are hiring, when your organization is situated in a community and you are hiring, and that community has people who have the qualifications needed by the organization, you must hire from the community. And collectivism and community demands that when you hire the father, when the next job arises and the son is also experienced, you hire the son also. Is this positive or negative? It depends on how it is handled. And I would still say, if it is practiced from a position of respecting the community in which the organization is working, then it can be positive for the organization. Disciplinary issues may actually even become less, because then the organization does not have to worry about discipline. The father will discipline his own son, whom he asked the organization to hire. And also, if people are hired from the community, it is possible that they actually see the organization as part of their community. So issues of reciprocity, solidarity come in. African values can also inform our practices in human resources management in as far as remuneration management is concerned. We value caring, reciprocity, and respect. And paying a fair wage is part of caring. A fair wage is part of reciprocating the value that has been given to the organization. And the fair wage is part of respecting the person who has invested in the organization in terms of their labor. The issue of respect, where wages are concerned, actually, in Africa, goes far back to the colonial period. So a salary that is not a fair wage actually represents the same disrespect that used to be meted out to Africans during the colonial period, i.e., you are not respecting their labor. But another issue relating to remuneration is that of managing tax. And for me, this used to cause me a lot of cognitive dissonance when I was practicing human resources management in the corporate world. You see, African values include relatedness, relationships. So the concept of family is held in very high regard. Then we go back to that issue of the Western definition of a family, the Western definition of a spouse, the Western definition of children. Most organizations, when they're talking about, for example, oh, the organization will pay school fees for your children. It's immediately followed up by not more than 2 children. And it will pay medical aid for your family, you and your spouse. What happens to the other spouses? Because this is an African environment, and that a man can have 3, 4, 6, 7, 10 spouses. It's not. So our African values can actually inform organizations to dispense those perks in a manner that respects people, in a manner that doesn't make people feel as if the way they are living their lives is wrong, because there's no wrong or right about it. It's a matter of preference. What should organizations do? Some organizations end up introducing what is called the cafeteria system. That is what the cafeteria system is meant to address. We are giving you so much for fees. Where the children will go to school is entirely up to you. How many children you'll be able to pay for is entirely up to you. We are only giving you X, Y, Z dollars. Then it allows the person to send their 110 children to schools that are that they can afford, instead of forcing them to send 2 children to a private school. Another area where our African values can inform our practices is in the area of integrated performance management. I'm saying integrated performance management to differentiate it from the regular performance management we meet largely in textbooks that assume that a good employee or a good performer is a lone ranger. And you get that a lot from individualistic societies. But in our African values, where we value community, where we value solidarity, we talk in terms of integrated performance management, meaning you are not able to do it on your own. You need the rest of the team. So you find that that value of community, that value of solidarity can assist organizations build high performance work teams. And that has to be followed up again. That has to also inform the way we practice our pay systems when we are paying for performance. Do you pay the individual and therefore encourage individualism and as pay is practiced in societies that value individualism, or do we pay teams? I believe African values can assist us in building strong teams within organizations by noticing that performance is not a one-person show. Realizing that to be a good performer, for the organization to perform, it needs everyone to contribute. And therefore, the African values of community, of solidarity, of I am because you are, they come into the picture. Another area where African values perhaps can inform our practices of human resources management is in the area of promotions. I think there are many an organization that have found themselves in problems when they promote people in a manner that disregards a natural hierarchy that already exists within the organization. When such people get singled out as the star performers, and then get promoted. What tends to happen is that then the performance doesn't come through because those same people have to work through the rest of the team. So it may be necessary for us to reconsider how we handle promotion. Long service awards, long service-based pay. How do we strike a balance between, yes, recognizing the so-called bright sparks, but at the same time without leaving them with no team to work with, meaning then there being an island of they can't achieve much when they're operating as an island of intelligence. Another area where African values come in is the psychological contract. In fact, in some businesses, actually, there isn't even any contract of employment. The whole thing is based on a psychological contract, i.e., the unwritten contract that is based on reciprocity. Retaining employees during turbulent times, when an organization may even not be able to pay the employees, like the current environment we're in, you will find that if the African value of reciprocity can actually assist organizations to retain their employees through the psychological contract. Psychological contract basically means there are certain assumed things that an organization will do for its employees, and there are certain assumed things that an employee will do for the organization. The contract is not written, but the contract is known to exist. Two other dimensions or human resources management that can be informed by our culture, our values, culture management, when an organization is trying to change its culture. Now, this is an organization that is going out of its way to decide what it is going to incorporate from its context and bring it into the organization so that contextual issues then inform how the organization does its work. It therefore involves an element of change management. And then the African value that will inform us is the common good, the respect, the solidarity. In many instances, when organizations are introducing change, they meet very stiff resistance. Not just from the rank and file of the employees, but even from the very people who are supposed to be pushing the change, because perhaps no respect has been shown for the common good, no respect has been shown for solidarity. And also perhaps because the way the organization has communicated the changes, it thought it could actually communicate the changes using its regular hierarchy. But in most instances, when you're introducing changes, you don't communicate through the regular hierarchy, because the hierarchy does not necessarily represent leadership, i.e., the hierarchy may represent how the organization is managed, but the hierarchy does not always represent leadership, because leadership does not necessarily exist within a hierarchy. Then finally, another area that can benefit from African values is diversity management. And the values I find relevant there for me are respect and hospitality. Diversity management talks about us having people of different persuasions in the workplace, us having, yes, women in the workplace, people from different parts of the world, different parts of the country, people with different spiritual beliefs, etc. The African value of respect, of hospitality, demands that we tolerate differences. And there's a whole talk around issues of tolerance and what is tolerance and who defines tolerance. But for as long as I believe we are guided by the African value of respect, hospitality, or accommodating others, then organizations may find it easier to practice diversity management without coming through as patronizing, for example. So what I'm saying is, for each dimension of human resources management, there are African values that can inform our practices or our actions. That we get most of these dimensions defined from a Western perspective does not mean that we do not have African values to guide those processes. But in most organizations, we tend to want to only stick with the Western perspective of how human resources management should be operationalized in an organization. And as a result, we have employees who live double lives, the real them and then them within the organization. And it is my view that for as long as we conduct our human resources management in that manner, it compromises our ability to excel. We will achieve more if as a people we remain true to who we are, establishing harmony in the physical, in the intellectual, and in the spiritual. And if we allow our human resources management practices to evolve with due consideration for our own context, our own worldviews, our own experiences. But for as long as we suffer from elements of cognitive dissonance, our performance in all spheres will remain compromised. So, human resources management, like leadership, like other forms of management, is a social construction. Therefore, it should reflect the context of where it is being practiced. And once we have alignment in that regard, I believe then organizations will be enabled to excel. Thank you. Kevin?
Thank you very much, Doc, for that presentation. Very insightful. I now open up the floor for questions and contributions. Please use the hand reaction emoji if you've got a question or a contribution, and we'll unmute you. Thank you. Any questions or contributions? Dr. Hungwe?
Thank you very much, Faith, for that presentation. I really appreciate it. I think you helped sort of get us closer to closing the loop from the presentation that was done by Prof Rukuni last week. I will hazard to say that Prof Rukuni painted a very rosy picture about the African culture and the Ubuntu and he ably presented an analysis of how we can maximize the benefits for an organization through Ubuntu, and how basically how we can maximize. Where I found your presentation interesting is that you pretty much told us that we still have a long way to go because we have a lot of things that are deep-seated in our culture which present challenges into the context of corporate culture and business as it is practiced today. For me, I just wanted to find out from you how our African culture, African values relate to teamwork. Because I mentioned that before, that the African culture is very good at the family level, but struggles as one moves away from the center and goes to community, village, district, and so forth. So what is your experience in human resources as to how teamwork can be built from African culture? And I'll just finish off by saying one of the biggest challenges that I have observed in corporate is the aspect of jealousy. But jealousy is a symptom of something, and I would like you to explain which value comes into play and manifests itself under the symptom of jealousy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hungwe. Dr. Mringani?
Thank you, Kelvin. Thank you, Dr. Ndabeni Baby. It's a great pleasure to listen to you after a long time. So I really enjoyed the presentation, particularly the way you bring the Western approaches and African values. And I think you did mention earlier on that there are some disagreements whether bringing African values works or not. And I also noticed that Iguisi and these other people who think like him, like Oztek or something like that, they argue that there is a challenge or there's a frustration that as much as we've had African companies or African businesses, these businesses have failed to create wealth for their societies. So people who make this accusation look at maybe the context of, if you look at Finland, where a company like Nokia managed to transform the economy. Then we also look at other various companies, which are multinationals, which obviously could have worked in Africa, but not necessarily for the Africans, but have worked very well for their societies. A good example is the Anglo-American Corporation, which was largely British, and where most of its profits were repatriated to Britain, whether for good or for bad. So there's this kind of frustration about whether African companies have done good enough for the societies. And I think then African values maybe becomes the missing link. As you said, that quite often you have this level of dissonance between yourself, what happens in the workplace, and what happens in the society. So my question is there a way for which African corporates themselves can bring us back to this starting point for us to go forward? Then the next question is on the concept of nepotism. So right now, as I speak, I'm speaking from the North, right? So I've observed some societies, in particular the Scandinavian society, and I've seen that it's very true that people want to work with somebody they know. And as you rightly pointed out, we know that one of the leading scholars in social sciences wrote and said that getting a job means that you need to know people. And this was an American by the name Granovita, who wrote a book around weak ties and strong ties. And I think, so there's a sense that we need to know people to get something done. But then, is the question not that we need to know people where we create these companies, but we don't need to know people, to work with people that we know, where there's a public expectation. So in other words, I'm trying to suggest that maybe there's a dichotomy between what the private corporation can do, because that is what I own, that is what you own, and you can decide in that dimension. But if we take the same HR practices to a public corporation, then there's a challenge, because this government or a government department is not the creation of any individual, where their own discretion should inform HR practices. And I got the feeling that the accusation about nepotism, or the frustration about nepotism, is largely reflected by citizens or by our communities in the context of government. Maybe it does apply in the context of firms, but I think to a small extent. Over to you, Doc.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mringani, for that. There's another question here for you, Dr. Bebe. A powerful message. I think it's high time organizations adopt African values and blend them in their day-to-day human resources management practices. My question is, how can an organization ensure a rapid paradigm shift in this regard? So I can hand over to you, Dr. Bebe, to respond to some of these questions.
Thank you. There was a question relating to jealousy. I think that was the first speaker. The question relating to, we are good when it concerns the family, but as we move further and further away from the family, that spirit of community is no longer there. As I was listening, I was thinking, I'm not sure, because you find that where people are accused of practicing nepotism, for example, the recruitment process goes like this. It's either first they're trying to get a job for their brother, for their cousin, for the young men from their village, for the person from their region, etc., etc. So I don't think as we move away from the family, that community feeling gets weaker. And then issues relating to was it jealous? I think something to that effect was mentioned. It is a scarcity mentality, I believe. And as long as there is not enough to go around, you will get those feelings of jealousy coming through from people wanting to benefit those who come from their own village, those who come from their own family, those who come from their own region. Perhaps that is where the community value at times may seem to be having unintended consequences. Then the next question related to the owners of the questions will need to remind me. Jonathan, what was the question? Sorry, I can't hear you actually.
Dr. Mringani, will unmute you.
Thank you. Yeah, so my first question is that there's a frustration that the African corporates or companies fail to create value for the society. So some people believe that this could be maybe because there's a missing link between these African values and what these people are, and maybe there's this kind of dissonance. So I was saying then in this case, is there a way to remedy this? Then the second question was on...
Okay, Jonathan, can you allow me to just speak to that one? Okay. My personal belief is that we are failing to create value for everyone else as African organizations, or enough to spread the wealth, if you like, because we are leading double lives. Most of us are leading double lives. We are Africans holding on to African values at night, but during the day, we are striving to be white. Sorry to put it that way, but I'm not sure how else to put it. So so you find that the average African, in my view, is a 2-in-1. By night, they are holding on to their values. Over the weekend, they are who they really are. But once they are in the office, what they practice is completely different. And for as long as we are like that, I don't think we'll be able, our organizations will be able to benefit the many, many other people that are supposed to benefit, because once they know they're supposed to do it, they are scared that it will be read as nepotism, or it will be read as bribing, or it will be read, all sorts of things.
Hello?
Yes, I'm waiting for Jonathan.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, yes, I agree with you. Then my other question was more to do with, so this accusation about nepotism, they tend to stand between the private sector and the public sector. So in the private sector, maybe the expectation is that this is my Kanban or this is your Kanban, and under such conditions, your discretion would apply. But in the public sector, I think there's a different understanding on how representativeness would work. And I feel that at times we conflate the nepotism as coming from both sides equally, but I think it's weighed more on the public side. Then my question is it then possible to create an understanding to the extent to which something can be perceived as an African, or maybe as more preferential, or more biased, or more nepotistic?
I understand what you are saying about the public sector. The public sector is for everybody, and therefore it is important that whatever happens there is transparent, and for us to be assured that every citizen who qualified was given an opportunity to have a go at whatever job is available. And when the job goes to whoever it goes to, yes, we all need to be assured that it went to the right person. But where I see problems at times is that even when the person is qualified, just because they are related to someone within that public sector, it becomes problematic. I really feel that we tend to overdo this nepotism issue, even where it should not apply. In the private sector, on the other hand, the private sector is about performance. The private sector is about results. The private sector is not likely to give a job to a relative who is just going to be packaged, or to a home boy who is just going to be part of the numbers. The private sector gives you jobs to people. Yes, they know. Yes, they may be related to, but who can perform.
Thank you very much, Doc. We have another question here. The issue of teamwork is well rehearsed in various social practices, such as Nimbe or Humwe, Kuronzera Mombe, Zundera Mambo, etc. These activities or practices engulf all societies beyond the family and boundaries. That's a contribution. And then there's another question here, Doc. How do we bring the African value of spirituality into the workplace and embed it as a practice? How do we experience spirituality and see it in an organization?
Spirituality is a difficult one. But I believe we need to bring it in. And that is where issues of tolerance come in. And that is where our values of respecting should allow all forms of spirituality to express themselves in the workplace. Where I have problems personally is when one form of spirituality is treated favorably to the disadvantage of other forms of spirituality. I have problems, for example, when someone is sick and they're supposed to bring a letter from the doctor, and someone brings a letter from Zinata and it is rejected. I have problems with that. I have problems with a certain room in an organization being used for prayers, but when someone goes with their snuff into that same room to go and do their prayers, it becomes a problem. So the issue of spirituality, yeah, a lot of controversy there. If you're going to do it, I think if an organization is going to do it, I think then we should allow all forms of spirituality to express themselves. If we don't have the guts to allow all forms of spirituality to express themselves, maybe then we should leave it out. Then in private organizations, fortunately, it would seem in most of them, the spirituality of the owner of the organization is the one that will be privileged.
Any more? Thank you very much, Doc, for that. Any more questions or contributions? Any more questions or
sorry. I'm curious to, oh, sorry.
Yes, you can continue. Yes, yes, Doc.
I'm curious to hear from the others. What are your views on this whole issue of definition of family, definition of marriage, definition of spouses, definition of perks that go to spouses? Even at death, organizations get confused and all sorts of things happen. And at times you end up with where there are multiple spouses, you end up with one spouse running off with all the benefits, etc., etc.
Anybody want to respond to that? Dr. Hungwe?
I'll start to just give a contribution on the spouses and children and all that. I think Prof Rukuni handled that quite well in his earlier presentations, where he said, you know, we follow the Western statutes, which were defined according to Western culture. And we have not tried to incorporate our culture into prevailing statutes. I think last year there was a big uproar when Parliament tried to pass a bill where they were going to recognize multiple spouses. I can't remember the exact detail, but there was a lot of noise in society about it. What worried me personally was that there was no debate, there was just reaction. And what I would like to see is the nation debating it, and so that the consensus comes from widespread discussion. But that's just my view. Before that, I had raised my hand to try and get back to that idea of teamwork. I believe that businesses in Africa, and anyway, succeed when there is valuable teamwork. And I mean, take the invention of or the production of a space shuttle. One university in Idaho, the Department of Chemistry, works on the fuels. University in California works on the materials for this. So different people come in and put in different things. And you didn't answer my question. In our culture, do we have room for that kind of cooperation? Because if we cannot get that level of cooperation, I don't know how we can move forward. Thank you.
Can I proceed?
Yes, you can, Doc.
I believe our culture actually, the way things get done, the way work gets done, the way funerals are conducted, everything is actually based on teamwork. I'm not very familiar with Shona culture, but I know that in Ndebele culture, they've got a practice called Ilima, where people come together and they may work on someone's field today and complete it, and all they get is maheu or that traditional beer, and the next day they're at someone else's house, or if the house is being built, they use the same method for making the bricks, etc. I really think African culture operates in teams. African work gets done in teams. I'm struggling to see where anything is done by a lone ranger. So if we were to take that and bring it into an organization, then that's where we can build high performing teams. Which is why earlier on when I was talking about performance management, I think I was talking in terms of practicing integrated performance management, where people work in teams as opposed to as individuals, and where they are rewarded in teams as opposed to as individuals. I believe that this working at an individual level is a Western creation that we find. Yes, we find it in our organizations, and even having bonuses paid on an individual basis, when in actual fact, our own work in our culture, in our cultures, we work through teams, through the whole community.
Thank you very much, Doc. Dr. Mringani?
Sure. Thank you once again. Yeah, I also wanted to make a contribution on the question that Dr. Ndabeni Bebe raised. So I think it's clear that there's two issues that are outstanding in terms of our customary practices in the workplace, but also in the way we do things. But I also feel that our culture works, and they are very correct, but we are not working. So we as individuals, we as a collective, we are not working. Why? Because if you look at the issues of labor and human resources, in Zimbabwe, we have had the Institute of Human Resources or Institute of something like that. So, but probably what we have missed from this institute is the discourse around the evolution of labor practices, the evolution of human relations. Like you said, that everything is evolutionary, but are we evolving? Then there's this issue about marriages and children. So while we claim to follow Christian or Western practices, but the very West that we claim to follow have evolved to understand that any living child of anyone who passes on should be a beneficiary of the estate. So we see that even, I mean, in other countries, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, all children are like to benefit from the estate of the deceased, as long as you are a legal child and you can be identified as a child. So there's no qualms about that. And we see the same societies are even changing the rules of inheritance, where women are now being elected a full regent. So all these things points to evolution. But I think obviously the challenge is if someone is in a favorable position, they are likely to resist change. So maybe we need more activists in the workplace, activists in the home. When I say activists, I'm not talking about rebellion or disorder. I'm talking about institutional entrepreneurs, or those who are going to see an opportunity for change to move the society forward. So I think that's what we need, that beyond ourselves, we have the urgency to change our present circumstances, but also influence the future. So this is an opportunity for us to challenge ourselves and say, why is it that our culture works, but we don't work?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mringani, for that. Dr. Bebe, you want to say something?
No. No.
Okay.
Or perhaps now that you have asked, the problem we have with our professional institutions like IPMZ, and similar other like that, is that very little critical thinking goes on there. Very little critical thinking. We need to find a way of linking up those professional associations. Perhaps, I don't know whether they can be linked up with universities, but we need more critical thinking in those areas. Right now, what is happening is just regurgitating whatever comes from the West, accepting it as best practice, and not interrogating why things are being done the way they're done.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc. There is a question here. What do we mean by spirituality? Is it religion? Or maybe it may include it, but it is much broader. Maybe our challenge of what spirituality makes it problematic to implement in organizations. I think our African challenge in whatever discipline of study or profession is that we have received Western education, developed and practiced in Western world, and we are to practice the same education here. How can we Africanize the education and have it work alongside the Western education? African philosophy is live, but it is still stifled. Any, you want to respond to that, Doc?
Yes. You see, personally, I believe the problem is that we don't live what we preach. I will keep saying, the average African is two people, at least two people in one. The person that is put out for the public to see, and then the person at home. Whereas in public spaces, we talk in terms of, yes, we should embrace our African values, etc., etc. When we go back home, the child can't even speak Shona. Your child can't even speak Shona. I bumped into one of my friends. I greeted the child in Shona. He said he doesn't understand Shona. So I thought, oh, because the mother is in Ndebele. I greeted it in Ndebele. He said she doesn't. I said, what does this child speak? What do you speak at your home? So yeah, for as long as we lead those dual lives, where what we say in the public domain is not what we practice, we will always have these problems. Dr. Muringani is laughing. Maybe his child can't speak Shona as we speak.
Yeah, because of time, we need to close off our session. So I don't know, Doc, do you have any final words before I hand over the floor to Prof Mandi to close off the session?
Yeah, perhaps. I believe our number one value, which I think can make a difference in organizations, is that one simple value called respect. If we can actually operationalize just one, respect other cultures, respect other communities, respect other people, respect other spiritual persuasions, etc., etc., and then we can make an impact in organizations.
Thank you very much, Doc. I'd like to hand over the floor to Prof Mandi to close off the session and share off his final sentiments. Over to you, Prof.
Thanks a lot, Kevin, and thanks a lot, Dr. Faith Kapeni Bebe, for a fantastic presentation and the interaction and responses to the comments and questions. I mean, I learned so much, and I think you closed off on probably the most important note by reminding us that once, in fact, maybe that's the common feature of what you were calling African values. If you have mutual respect amongst those who may come from different persuasions, then you have the real starting point of African values. Then only when there is mutual respect are you likely then to have mutual benefit and mutually beneficial policies and activities, and mutual responsibility or mutual accountability is more possible when there is mutual respect. So I really appreciated that. And you kept saying things that I've heard from colleagues and colleagues in this platform where we're debating these issues for a long time, that we're living these double lives. Our younger generation really, my generation and those closer to my generation, we are struggling to pass down to the younger generation what we really are capable of doing to make life more meaningful for us as Africans. And I think Dr. Faith also touched on that in a sense that at the end of it all, doesn't matter what culture you're from, what ethnic group you're from, there is no perfect one, and there's or religion for that matter. In fact, political persuasion, religious persuasion is probably even worse. It doesn't matter which persuasion. There's none that's perfect, and at the end of it all, it's not about perfect African values and culture being perfect. It's not about African worldviews being, so to speak, correct, because there's no worldview that is. What is important in this conversation and what I got out of Dr. Ntabeni-Bebe's talk is to say that it's about a societal value system providing a set of compass-bearing values are generated from there. And ultimately, those are the same ones that lead to legal traditions and legal systems that if those are not mutually agreed upon, you will never agree on anything. There's no religions. There's more than 4,000 organized religions in the world, and each one really has its own idea of what spirituality is and who God is, and it's there's no need to agree except to say that we mutually respect, and it's all streams trying to flow to the same sea. So the important thing, I think in conclusion, is to say that I would say let's spend less time trying to pass value judgments on anyone's culture, including ours, because that is what has killed us, and that's how colonialism continues to thrive. Is we were still, and we are still kind of stuck in the idea that you can analyze the value system and pass value judgments to say this is good, this is better, or so our culture is better here, is not as good over there. I don't think our conversations here are aimed at that. We will never resolve that. The point is, once you know that somebody is Japanese or American or German or whatever, you now know that their worldview will be different from yours. And as such, they will probably come from a different set of values on some issues. There will be a few issues which are common across. But the thing that killed us in terms of colonialism is because it was based on race. So the Europeans had no difficulty getting together as they were colonizing Africa and the rest of the world. What they would do is, I I use the example of United States, Canada. Take Canada, for instance. I mean, it was all manner of European countries fighting in different parts. It eventually becomes Canada. But what do? The Europeans are aware that they've brought to this place a multiplicity of legal systems. They brought the Roman legal system, which kind of angered quite a few of the European nations. Then they bring the French, then they bring English common law. So when you actually look at the Constitution of Canada and how they have shaped their legal system, they acknowledge in the Constitution that it is a pluralistic legal system. It's what they call mixed legal jurisdiction. They will then say, we have French law, Roman law, Dutch law, and English common law, and they fashion them together to make it possible for the whole of society and the whole educational system from primary school to university, PhD, those legal traditions are taught in the law schools. They will know how the Romans came up with such a law and for what reason, and how the Dutch, so the traditions explain the legal traditions, and then the legal traditions explain the legal systems that come out of it. But when they're done with colonizing and agreeing upon themselves, and they make their way to Southern Africa and East Africa, they will bring those same European laws, and they'll say, oh, it's Roman Dutch law, like in South Africa, which we adopted, and then they add English common law. But they'll never integrate the African laws. So I'm just saying, it's up to us Africans to actually go back to our parliament and say, we have to amend our constitutions and declare all our countries are mixed legal jurisdictions that require integration of these African laws, so that it's not an issue of this legal system is better than the other. Because just to give you an example of close to home, Roman Dutch law, primarily there's nothing wrong with how the laws were developed in that part of the country. But some people bring them to South Africa and they create an apartheid system using the law. Then when apartheid ends, there's absolutely no difficulty in saying, no, Roman Dutch law is perfect. It's African law which is the problem. That's why it cannot go into our constitution as a legal system. But how could a Roman Dutch system have created apartheid, except that it's not about the legal system. It's about the political process which leads to manipulation of the systems. So it's a bit of a digression, but I thought I needed to take that digression in thanking Dr. Ntabeni Bebe for having really expanded this conversation and brought it home in very practical terms. We just need more of this kind of conversation, and I hope that Dr. Ntabeni Bebe's presentation will be shared widely with other people, and that maybe one day we'll come back again with more of the HR practitioners and probably a bigger audience. We have to keep discussing these issues. I don't know how much I could thank you, Dr. Faith, for this, and all the best to you and your endeavors. And thanks to colleagues who came in to have a conversation with her, and good night.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bebe, for joining us. I would like to thank you, and thank you everyone else for coming in tonight. This brings our session to an end. For those who are joining us for the first time, please don't forget to subscribe on our social media platforms, Dr. Prof Mandi Rukuni on Facebook, and on YouTube, Dialogue with Prof Mandi Rukuni. Thank you very much, and good night.